Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to update you as to what's happening in the Chinese economy. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that the start of 2024 has been a very difficult period for China. The stock market's hit a 5-year low, and there are concerns about what's happening in terms of growth and foreign investment. Now, the Chinese have just seen the end of their Lunar New Year holiday period, when everybody closes down the factories and they all go home to their regions and have 2 or 3 weeks off. Everybody is now back at work, and the expectation in the markets was that we could see a bounce back in the Chinese stock markets, that things may start to improve as the Chinese authorities increase their stimulus package. However, on the first day back, the market's disappointed. There wasn't a strong recovery, and the Chinese central bank didn't cut interest rates recently. There was an expectation that they may reduce the rates to try to boost everything, but that didn't happen. And so everybody is now concerned that 2024 is going to continue being a bad year. And in today's video, I want to talk about what's happening with foreign investment, because it's down to its lowest level for 30 years. And the reason for that is that foreign companies are concerned that China isn't going well and that they would be better off investing their money elsewhere around the globe. And from an economic point of view, the withdrawal of investment can become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if investment drops, then obviously output drops, so does profitability, and therefore the economy isn't going to grow as rapidly as it would do if it had that external investment. So in today's video, we'll have a look at some data on what's happening with regards to foreign direct investment. We'll also talk about what's happening with direct investment in a large region of China called XINJIANG, which is where the Uyghurs live, who are a minority based in China. And over the past 10 years or so, there have been multiple accusations made by various bodies around the world of human rights violations by China against the Uyghurs. And as a direct result of this, we are now starting to see Western companies closing their facilities down. The giant German chemicals business, BASF, made famous in the 70s and 80s through their cassette tapes, you may well have owned one of those, has recently announced that it's closing 2 of its facilities in the region. And other companies such as Tesla, Volkswagen and General Motors are now being told that they need to check their supply chains to check whether or not some of the materials that they're using in manufacturing in China are coming from what's called forced labour camps. So I'll have a look in more detail at what's going on with regards to that region, and then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think is happening in China right now, what the implications of the withdrawal of overseas investment will be for the Chinese economy for 2024, and what's likely to happen for the rest of this year in terms of GDP. But before we get started on all of that, once again I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. It really does help to support the channel. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, direct investment in China by overseas companies is now down to its lowest level since 1993. This chart shows the annual amount invested into China by overseas companies dating back to 1990. And the scale on the right hand side of this chart is measured in billions of dollars and goes from 0 at the bottom to 350 billion at the top. And what this chart shows is that back in 1990, the total amount invested into the Chinese economy was only $3.5 billion. That figure rose to $27.5 billion in 1993. And over the following decade, the level of investment rose at a pedestrian rate and hit $49.5 billion in 2003. However, in the period between 2004 and 2013, there was a rapid increase in the amount invested as companies decided that they wanted to move their manufacturing facilities to China and also wanted to benefit from making sales in China itself. And in 2013, the total amount invested by overseas companies was more than $290 billion, which represents an increase of more than 10 times against the figure back in 1993. Now, between 2013 and 2017, there was a reduction in the amount invested each year by overseas companies, and in 2017 it was down to $166 billion. We then saw a recovery over the next 4 years, and in 2021 a record total of $344 billion was invested into China. However, as you can see, over the last 2 years, there has been a dramatic fall in the total invested. In 2022, the figure fell to $180 billion, and in 2023, it was down to $33 billion, which is the lowest that has been seen since 1993. So this represents a total crash in terms of the amount of cash being invested by overseas companies into Chinese joint ventures. And this is for two reasons. Firstly, there are concerns over what's happening in the Chinese economy. So overseas companies are no longer bullish in terms of attacking that market. And secondly, there are now concerns with regards to sanctions and other issues that have been applied against China, which is restricting the use of cutting-edge technology. The German chemical giant BASF, which I mentioned at the start of the video, you may be familiar with the name from the cassette tapes from the 70s and 80s, but obviously that was a very small part of its business, but it made it a household name all around the world. But it is an absolutely huge chemical business, and it has a number of joint ventures across China, and the company has now announced that it's exiting from 2 of those joint ventures over concerns over human rights violations. BASF has announced that it's selling its stake in 2 joint ventures in the Chinese region of Xinjiang, where human rights groups have documented abuses, including forced labour in detention camps. The company said the divestment of its shares in the joint venture with Xinjiang marker chemical industry was mainly due to high carbon dioxide emissions and competitive pressures in the market. Recently published reports related to the joint venture partner containing serious allegations that indicate activities inconsistent with BASF's values. Consequently, BASF will accelerate the ongoing process to divest its shares, it said in its statement. It added that its audits have not found any evidence of human rights violations at the 2 joint ventures, and that it has no indication that employees at them were involved in such violations. So on the one hand here, BASF are saying that there is no evidence of human rights violations. However, they're saying they're also exiting from China as a result of policies that are inconsistent with their company values. So let's talk about what's going on with regards to human rights violations and whether or not there's any evidence of it happening in China.
The UN says China may be guilty of crimes against humanity in its treatment of Uyghur Muslims. Michelle Bachelet, the UN's outgoing human rights chief, made the claim in a long-delayed report. In May, Bachelet visited Xinjiang in China's northwest, which is home to around 10 million Uyghurs, a mainly Muslim ethnic minority. The lengthy report said, quote, serious human rights violations have been committed in the province. It says allegations of arbitrary detention and forced medical treatment of Uyghurs are all credible. The UN is calling on Beijing to immediately release all those detained in training centres, prisons or detention facilities. Rights groups have accused Beijing of abuses against Uyghurs that include the mass use of forced labour in internment camps. The United States has accused China of genocide. China has vigorously denied the allegations and urged the UN not to release the report. Within hours of the report's release, it branded it a farce planned by the US, Western nations and anti-China forces. Bachelet herself has come under fire for being too soft on China. She released the report only minutes before her 4-year term ended on Wednesday. She now plans to retire in Chile.
So as you just heard, the United Nations have identified potential human rights violations against an ethnic minority group in China called the Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs are located in the area of Xinjiang. And this area has huge amounts of natural resources. It has oil and gas and iron ore and coal, and is also one of the largest producers of cotton across China. Now, back in the 1940s, the Uyghurs made up a large percentage of the population in this region. However, oil and gas were found in the region in 1955. And after that, the Chinese authorities introduced the labour transfer program, whereby they took people from rural areas all around China and moved them into the region to work both in the oil and gas industry and also in newly created factories. And as a direct result of this policy, the non-Uyghur population grew significantly. And the total population in the region today is around 26 million, of which around 10 million are Uyghurs. And back in the 1990s, a number of separatist movements started up, supported by overseas organisations. And over the following 20 years, there were many protests held by the Uyghurs, during which there were clashes with the authorities and many people died. In 2017, the Chinese authorities introduced new laws and legislations against terrorism and identified some of the Uyghur separatist groups as being terrorists. Now, in terms of detailed information, it's difficult to be able to get anything because China restricts what overseas journalists are allowed to report. However, it's been reported that centres were set up, large centres, potentially housing up to 1.5 million people. And these were designated as educational centres. However, some of the reports coming out of China say that there were human rights violations committed in these centres and that some of them were used for forced labour. So basically, people were being forced to do jobs that they didn't want to do. And there were also reports that some of the Uyghurs were relocated, taken away from rural areas and moved to factories hundreds and thousands of miles away from where they lived and forced to work in jobs that they didn't want to do. The Xinjiang region of China is one of the world's largest producers of aluminium, or aluminum, depending on how you pronounce it. It's said to produce around 10% of the global supply. And there are now accusations that the aluminium industry is using forced labour from the Uyghurs. And as a result of that, companies that are using aluminium produced in China are now being urged to look at where it's coming from, and if it's coming from this region, to start boycotting it. And these accusations are now causing problems for major car manufacturers with facilities in China, such as Tesla, General Motors and Volkswagen. It's been reported that the USA is now beginning to detain imports of aluminium products suspected of being made through forced labour, particularly from China's Xinjiang region, and this metal now joins cotton, tomatoes and polysilicon that are all produced from this area. And companies such as BMW and Volkswagen are now facing scrutiny over where they're supplying their raw materials from. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about what's happening in the Chinese economy for a long period of time. And as you'll know, over the last few months, there have been serious concerns raised about what's going to happen in 2024. We had a pause for the Lunar New Year, and there was expectations that things could bounce back, that everybody would come back with renewed vigour, that the markets would take off, they'd get back from their 5-year low and start to recover, and that the outlook for the rest of this year would start to pick up. However, we haven't seen that happening in the markets yet. The markets are remaining in the doldrums, predominantly due to the fact that the Chinese authorities didn't take the opportunity over the break to actually add some stimulus into the economy. So they haven't done anything to help kickstart things. And what we're talking about in today's video is a reduction in direct overseas investment. And of course, from China's point of view, they want as much overseas investment as possible. It's not just the injection of capital that's important from China's point of view, it's also the joint venture, adding overseas brands to things that are made in China to give them more credibility on a global context. So what we've seen in today's video is that direct investment is down to its lowest level for 30 years. And this is a major worry. We saw in 2022 that there was a huge reduction in investment, and that has absolutely collapsed in 2023. And given what's happening so far in 2024, it's unlikely that this year is going to see a remarkable turnaround, because we've got concerns over what's happening in terms of domestic demand in China. We've also got concerns with regards to sanctions that are being applied against technology, that Chinese companies are not able to access cutting-edge artificial intelligence technology chips, so they can't include that sort of technology in the products that they're making. And so when you combine those factors, it's unlikely that overseas companies are going to want to increase the amount they're investing into China right now. And also, when you take a step back and have a look out the window as to what's happening around the rest of the world, we've got a recession officially now in Japan, the UK, Germany. We've got high rates of inflation affecting a lot of economies around the world, which has resulted in high interest rates, which are causing borrowing costs to go up for companies and individuals and are putting pressure on their own domestic economies. So the overall picture right now isn't good in terms of increasing investment. Companies can't access cheap debt, therefore they're finding it more difficult to get cash to invest into their own businesses. So the outlook for overseas investment isn't strong for 2024. And so China is going to have to kickstart its own economy. It needs to get its own domestic demand back up. But if you've been following the channel, you'll know that China is currently sitting with deflation. Prices have been going down consistently in China, and factory gate prices have gone down in virtually every single one of the last 16 months. And that tells us that prices on the shelves are unlikely to start going up anytime soon because the sales price is going down. And so what we're seeing is China now sinking into a period of deflation and reduced demand. And Chinese consumers are actually saving more than they ever have done before. So what we're seeing is reduced levels of demand, and that's going to cause a major problem for China for the rest of 2024. So the overall summary of today's video is that China has started off 2024 badly. It's expecting to hit 5% GDP growth for 2024. However, there's a major question mark over whether China will be able to achieve that, given the fact that overseas investment is down to its lowest level for 30 years, and that companies around the world are actually struggling right now. So it's unlikely that we will see a huge increase in those levels of investment in the back half of 2024. The Chinese authorities need to do something to kickstart their own economy. They haven't done that yet, and the longer they leave it, the more difficult it's going to be to turn things around. And of course, the one thing we haven't even touched on in today's video is the property sector in China, which makes up around 25% of GDP and is still in dire straits. We saw Evergrande going into liquidation recently, and it's likely that other companies will follow suit. So things are looking quite serious in China right now, and whether or not it can achieve its 5% GDP growth target for 2024 remains to be seen. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.